Hate speech doesn't exist. It's a bogus scaremongering tactic meant to discredit the messenger in order to avoid engaging with the messenger's arguments. What the progressive left calls hate speech is in fact political speech that should be the most protected speech on the block. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of this series of Feel-Good Mythology. In this episode, we'll talk about hate speech. In the following episode, we'll address one by one several feel-good mythologies that, while they're popular, are still, well, mythology. The following episodes will address the democracy is inherently good myth and the moderation is preferable myth. As time goes on, I'll probably build more on this series and hopefully get Andre to build a nice special intro for this series. Anyway, enough with the introduction, although this particular topic is probably the easiest of the series. So, every era has its beyond the pale speech, i.e. things that you're not supposed to say. Political correctness is a new phenomenon only insofar as it is particularly insidious and particularly more totalitarian than other similar phenomena on a historical scale. Nevertheless, political correctness still fits on the wider historical continuum, and you'll excuse me for using this word, which is rather common to progressive journalists, particularly feminist journalists. The best way to explain this is to provide examples of things that were hate speech at some point in time. And here are some examples. Slavery should be abolished. Working class men should vote. The church ought to be separated from state. The Pope is the Antichrist. And yes, a Czech man named Jan Hus was burned at the stake for heresy for uttering words to this effect. Hail Satan! Maybe killing off an entire village is not a good idea. A member of the Soviet Politburo was shot in the head for this hateful, heretic, unprogressive, and barbaric proposal. This tobacco is better thanks to science. Catholic chemist Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier was beheaded for altering the tobacco and for claiming that science is good. That's French Revolution for you progressives out there. Masturbation has fewer negative effects, if any, than the establishment claims. I could go on like this for an hour. Now notice that I didn't just pick speech that was illegal. For instance, I'm not aware of any moment when defending masturbation was illegal per se, but in the 19th century there were places in Europe where such statements could bring you social ostracism because it was immoral or unholy to make such statements. Pretty much in the same fashion as it happens today if you use your democratic entitlement to back positions against gay marriage. The former CEO of Mozilla can tell you more about that. So on a historical scale, it is not particularly unusual or unheard of things that were at some point in time deemed to be hate speech or immoral or radical or whatever the label harsh enough to warrant censorship, be it social censorship or state-enforced censorship through physical elimination. Every society has its uptight morons who are so thin-skinned that they can't bear the existence of a different point of view. But what makes the label hate speech so bad today in comparison with the past is the fact that today's uptight morons don't have the same excuses that the censors of the past had. For instance, the beheading of Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier happened in part because of an inherent fear of science. I say in part because politics also had something to do with that, namely that Lavoisier's politics were a bit too different than the contemporary tyrant, Maximilien Robespierre. Long story on that, but at the very least, Lavoisier's detractors had no way of checking his work. It was, indeed, quite hard to prove that he's right. The progressive left of today, however, the progressives that wield the hammer of hate speech, do not have this same excuse. They also don't have the excuse of fighting any genuine oppression. Because you see, whereas the French Revolution tyrants ended up being a bunch of bloodthirsty, fucked-in-the-head cretins, the regime they fought against was also a bloodthirsty, messed-up regime. Social justice warriors of today don't have that excuse either. On the contrary, those whining about hate speech today tend to be some of the most well-off people that have ever lived in the history of mankind. And there's another excuse that modern-day enforcers of this speech code don't have: the benefit of the doubt. Whereas those who would try to ostracize anyone defending masturbation, for instance, over 200 years ago, had no way of checking or testing those views against reality, the modern-day uptight morons do have such ways. That's why one should judge past historical mistakes in their historical context. I mean, seriously, how would one test the effects of masturbation in 1820? You couldn't. And the sensible attitude in that context was to rather refrain from the practice altogether, since that wisdom had served your society, your forefathers, and your context quite well. The same doesn't apply now at all. It's easy to check whether the wage gap, for instance, is bollocks or not. It's also easy to check whether there is such thing as a rape culture or not. And the enforcers, that would be the actual ideologues behind this nonsense, not the useful idiots on Tumblr, know this all too well. They really do. One way to see this is through their constant attempts to redefine words and manipulate or even restrict thought. Why would you want to change the definition of, let's say, rape if you're completely and utterly convinced that there is a rape culture in Europe? Why would you want to redefine racism to mean criticism of Islam if you're so utterly convinced that the criticism that the religion of peace gets is unfair? Well, it's because you know you're wrong, and you know that your ideas cannot survive those pesky free people speaking openly, so one way to avoid having your ideas challenged is to redefine concepts in such a way that they favor your view and paints the people, not their ideas, but the people themselves, as horrible individuals. And the reason this thing works is because most people do care about being seen as good, moral, and virtuous people. If racism had been so prevalent, then shouting, "Hey, that's racist! You're racist!" wouldn't work. If we had actually been living in a rape culture, then allegations of rape apologism wouldn't work. Do you think that a march to take back the night and kick back against rape culture would have any meaning in a genuine rape culture like the Democratic Republic of Congo? If you do, you're probably on the wrong channel. The reality is that hate speech is merely the new unholy, and it doesn't really exist. One can argue that there is such thing as hateful speech, namely speech that exists as a result of the utterer's hatred towards something or someone. But even that one should be protected, and indeed in most cases it is. There are millions of videos on YouTube that can be classified as hateful speech, in which content creators rant against Apple, Microsoft, white people, Obama, Rush Limbaugh, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, you name it. There are people who genuinely do hate Apple, or Donald Trump, or Rush Limbaugh, or Obama, or white people. And here at Freedom Alternative, we do support all of these haters' right to express their hatred. On the progressive left, on the other hand, only some hatred is okay. Hateful speech on Rush Limbaugh is perfectly fine. Hateful speech on white people gets you clicks, Patreon cash, and props from the establishmentarian cucks. Hateful speech on Obama? No, that's a no-no. To make things worse, many of the things labeled as unholy, as hate speech these days, does not even fit the kind of category of hateful speech, but rather as inconvenient, non-leftist speech. A politician in the Netherlands was convicted for hate speech and was told that the truth is not a defense. So while what he said was not just a political opinion, which should have been protected anyway, but an indisputable fact, and that was still not good enough. Never before has it been the case that the censors not only knew, but were convinced and openly admitting that what they were censoring is true, but still be completely convinced that that fact should be censored. And this is creepy as fuck in and of itself. I had a guy the other day telling me that it doesn't matter if Muslims are overrepresented in certain crimes. I shouldn't say it anyway, and it would be even better if we'd stop collecting data on this thing altogether, because it incites to racism. There are millions of these people out there who genuinely think that suppressing the truth is a fabulous idea, and some of them do write laws in various countries and jurisdictions. Now, how does one defend oneself against this? Well, for starters, don't concede to their phony, outrage-driven, imaginary moral high ground. The proper response to, "Hey, that's hate speech" type of whining is, go fuck yourself. Oh, and fuck your moral high ground. The proper response to, "Hey, you can't say that" is, "Yes, I can, and I will. Now, kindly, go fuck yourself." This cannot be stressed enough. Being polite in the face of evil is a losing strategy. And make no mistake, attempting to knowingly silence what you know full well to be true is evil in and of itself. So, does hate speech even exist? Nope. But even if it did, it should still be protected, if not out of principle, at least out of pragmatic reasons. Suppressing something, no matter how good you may feel it may be, has negative long-term consequences. Why? Because censoring something doesn't make it go away. It just drives it into the underground, where it festers and becomes even more aggressive. And yes, that means that the most appalling things, from neo-Nazi parades to Bolshevik collectives and anything in between, ought to be tolerated to express themselves. Having the loons in the public square may be annoying, but we can all observe them. Having the loons in the underground puts them away from any sort of honest inquiry and scrutiny. And sooner or later, they will bite. So yeah, hate speech is really just feel-good mythological terminology meant to emotionally justify appalling totalitarian measures to those applying the measures, who again usually tend to know full well that what they're doing is wrong. Yes, free speech is messy and triggering and offensive and whatnot, and yes, it is the hard way towards the progress of thought, but it's also the right way. And with that, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.